everybody. I'm Marisa, Rabbi Marisa James. I'm a member of CBST. This is wonderful.
Can you turn up your volume just a little bit?
I can turn up my volume, yes, thank you. I'm getting over a little bit of a cold, so if I start making lots of noise, I apologize in advance. So there are two things I want to start with. One is that this is a 45-minute session, and Islam 101 should actually be like an entire year-long course. So I just want to kind of set some reasonable, imagine if you had 45 minutes to teach Judaism 101. It's going to be a very, very small beginning, but this, as the rabbi said, is the beginning of a series of things. So this may be things that you already know. This may cover some material that seems incredibly basic. This may cover some stuff that you're like, oh, I had no idea. But please know that whatever we don't talk about tonight, there are going to be many more sessions. And if there are particular things that you're interested in learning more about, particular issues, particular nations or sects or anything, please let us know, because we will shape the coming sessions based on what people really are excited to learn about. The second thing I wanted to start with is actually a story, because I start almost everything with a story. So one of my weird little interests is airport prayer spaces. I love airport prayer spaces. Whenever I'm traveling, I go looking for them. I'm fascinated by the fact that there's no constant how they're set up. There's, some places there's one room with everything in it, and some places there's like a corridor, and it's like here are the Southern Baptists, and here are the Buddhists, and and there's a whole corridor of everything. And you just never know what you're going to get. So about 2 years ago, I think a year ago, I went looking. I have had many long stopovers in Istanbul, and I had seen on the airport maps, because I'm one of those people who looks at the airport maps, that there are actually 4 mosques in the Istanbul airport. There's one each in domestic departures, international departures, domestic arrivals, and international arrivals. And I thought, okay, I've got a several-hour stopover. Let me go look for the mosque. And I had my tallis in my bag. This is not my tallis. I stole this from upstairs. I will put it back. And so I had my carry-on or whatever. The men's side of the mosque, you could look straight in the door and see that it was a room very much like this one, except with windows looking out on the tarmac. And there were people, praying. There were people resting. And then there was a room next to it that was the women's side of the mosque. And there, just because of the way the architecture was, you went in, and then there was a whole row of shelves to put your shoes and your luggage on, and then the prayer space was around the corner. So I was sort of, cautiously poking my head in, and some woman came up to me and said, "Oh, do you want to pray? Come on in, don't be nervous. You can put your shoes here. No one will take them, I promise. You can put your..." And I said, "Well, thank you, but just I'm not Muslim. Is that okay?" And she said, "Oh, it's fine. What, Christian, Jewish? Come in. Put your shoes over here. Put your thing up. Great." So I put my shoes down, I put my bag down, and I took my tallis out. Because you cover your head when you're praying if you're a woman in Islam. So I put my tallis over my head. And the funny thing is that the tallis I had with me was actually a Turkish bath towel that I had turned into a tallis. And I, fling it over my head, and I start doing my prayers, and then realized that all the women in the mosque are looking at me like... And the woman who had invited me in English said to me, "Excuse me, do you mind if we ask why you have that on your head?" And I explained that Turkish towels actually look almost like this, except they're wider. But they have the stripes and they have the fringe, and I had just added tzitzit to them. And I wound up teaching a little bit of a Judaism 101 about tallis, about the talitot, and the fact that traditionally women don't wear them, and I do. And so it was a very fun experience of going into somebody else's prayer space and then being asked to explain some of my own religious stuff. So through the entire series, through this entire CBST initiative, I just want to invite us all to feel like we're all teachers and we're all students, and we're always being looked at by others who are curious, and we're always looking at others with curiosity. And that curiosity can lead to wonderful things. nice introduction. I'm not going to give a very serious history of Islam. Again, that is something else that could be like an entire course of its own. But Islam is one of the youngest world religions. And for those of you who have been coming with us on Fridays to greet worshipers coming to the NYU Islamic Center, how many of you have come on a Friday? Great, thank you. What are some of the things people have said to you? Salam alaikum. Welcome. Thank you. Shabbat shalom. Thank you. Okay, blessings. Has anybody said anything about Abraham to you? No? So one thing that a lot of people will say if you're visiting a mosque or if you have Muslims who are visiting the synagogue, one of the things that often comes up is this idea that we're all children of Abraham. Because in Muslim tradition, in Jewish tradition and Muslim tradition, Abraham has two sons. We come down through Isaac, and Muslims come down through Ishmael. And so when we come together, there's a very, very common feeling of like, well, we have to say, like, we're cousins. Like, of course we're doing this together. Like, we're the descendants of these brothers. And some of the ways that Judaism talks about what our core values are, and some of the ways that Muslims talk about what their core values are, really goes straight back to Abraham. Abraham as the one who opens up the tent to welcome strangers who are lost in the desert or wandering in the desert, messengers who are coming to bring news. And that Abraham is the one with this incredible hospitality, this incredible generosity, that instead of looking and seeing, oh, there's 3 men coming through the desert, that might be scary, that Abraham says, quick, let's make them a meal and let me wash your feet and come and sit down and rest yourself. That's something that we have taken into our tradition as Jews about what does it mean to be children of Abraham. And that's something that Muslims also have taken into the tradition as what does it mean to be children of Abraham. Now, the other thing that is something that was fascinating to me to learn, you probably heard the phrase the people of the book, right? That Jews and Christians and Muslims, because our books, our holy books, build on each other, that the Jews brought the Old Testament, all of these beautiful writings, that Christianity brought a New Testament that was meant to continue on and adapt and give commentary to and update the tradition. And then the Quran comes and retells some of these stories and re-explains some of the laws, but in a way that's all meant to be a continuous flow. It's a lot of text to try to read. I mean, as we know just from trying to read through the Torah every year, it's a lot of text to try to read. But there's a way in which each of the religions builds on the previous one. And so one of the core beliefs of Islam is that anybody who is deeply, seriously monotheistic, that anybody who, like Abraham, sees that there is one God, dedicates their life to serving that one God, and in whatever way people define it, submits themselves to the will of God, is therefore a Muslim. So by Islamic law, anybody who is a devoted monotheist can be defined as being a Muslim. It doesn't mean that we're all going to a mosque. It doesn't mean that we pray in the same way with the same words. It does not mean that we observe the same dietary laws. But the word Muslim, the word Islam, from salam, shalom, Islam has to do with submitting oneself, of giving oneself over completely. And so a Muslim, think about the word Kadesh, to make holy. Mikdash, with the mem in the beginning, is the one who makes holy. It makes it the active thing. It's the same thing with this, that a Muslim is the one who makes themselves in the service of God continuously. So it's less the word Christianity, the word Christian, like we inherently understand what that means in terms of someone who defines himself as Christian believes in Christ, that there's a person that's connected to that, there's a name of God that's connected to that, there's a person that's connected to that. But the word Muslim and the the word Islam instead has to do with the action of dedicating oneself, of being in service to. So it's a very different conception of how religion works. We would, it's very, I cannot imagine any of my Christian friends saying, oh, well, you're also a monotheist, so clearly you're also a good Christian, right? It's a very different, it's a different way of looking at what religion is. And so similarly, Muslims see Abraham as being the first to articulate this vision of what it means to be in service to God, that then continues with Moses, that then continues with Miriam, that continues with, for Muslims, that continues with Jesus and Mary, that continues with, and then ends with Muhammad. So all of the people who we consider prophets, Muslims also consider prophets. The people who Christians consider to be prophets, Muslims also consider to be prophets. And they see Muhammad as having been the last one to receive a dictation, like words directly from God, and to transmit them in such a way that there's this message that in the Muslim tradition ends the holy text that comes directly from the divine. So that holy text is fascinating. We are used to hearing the Torah. We are used to chanting it out loud and telling stories with it. We're used to stories that we can tell children with it. We're used to having, a drasha on Friday night or Saturday morning that pulls from stories and pulls from commentary, and then, how does that mean our life is like the life of this person or that person in this storyline? And the Quran is much less narrative. So the tradition is that Muhammad was actually not a particularly important person. He was a merchant. He was married to a woman who was a very successful merchant. His wife was much more accomplished than he was. And then the story is that one day Muhammad receives this message that just says, recite. Go and recite. And he goes through a period of intense doubt and intense, he can't believe that why would he, this very unimpressive, minor regional merchant, be getting messages from the divine to transmit. But eventually he's convinced by this voice, and he starts reciting, and he starts writing down all the things that he hears. The text is really hard to get through, because it's not in the narrative structure that we are so accustomed to having. It's a little more like Leviticus, where there's a little bit of narrative, then there's a little bit of rules, then there's a little bit of this one is that one's father, and that one is this one's child, and this one is connected to this one, and by the way, you shouldn't do this. So it's a harder text to access if you don't have someone studying it with you. But at the same time, from the very beginning, there was a tradition of learning it by heart. So from the time, the fact that Muhammad's commandment was to recite, it wasn't actually to write it down, it was really to recite. Quran comes from the same root, the same Semitic root as Hebrew for kara, likro, to read, to say out loud, to call. And so this commandment to recite is something that is worked into every way that the Quran is transmitted. So even children, this is actually something that's been really wonderful to see, that I've been very lucky to see, that they have Quran recitation competitions. And you'll see these kids, children memorize things faster than adults, you know this, little bastards. But they will literally learn it, and they'll memorize. Imagine memorizing the entire Torah, and then just getting up and having an 8-year-old chant the entire thing in front of you by heart. This is something that is still done, that is still deeply valued. And it's an incredible thing to see happening. If I ever hear about one happening in New York that is open to the public, I will absolutely make sure that we get an invitation as CBST to come and hear it. It's pretty incredible. So I want to, okay, we're going to have to share, I think, but that's okay. We like each other, right? All of you, all of us, we like each other, that's good. I think there are 30 copies. I wildly underestimated. This is wonderful. Yes.
In that prayer space, a mosque in the airport, where the chairs are, they sit.
No, the question was in the prayer space in the airport for my opening story. Were there chairs or did they just sit on the floor? Yeah, there are no chairs. There are no chairs. Right, we'll get to the prayer in a minute, but no, it's just like an open carpeted space and everybody takes off their shoes to make sure that you're not there.
I can read from afar.
They have one extra.
Oh, that's good.
I could share with you. You're wonderful.
Anybody else need one?
So, I also wanted to think for a minute about what it takes to become Jewish. If you are somebody who is not born Jewish, think about if you know somebody in your family or your friends who became Jewish, if you yourself became Jewish, think about the sheer amount of stuff that one needs to learn and understand and whatever before one gets to become Jewish, right? A lot of stuff. This page I just handed you is what you need to know and agree to in order to become Muslim. You could literally convert, like if I had someone, a Muslim with me now who was willing to do it, we could literally ask you to say this first pillar, the 5 pillars of Islam, the 5 core important things about Islam, to recite the statement of belief, the one sentence statement of belief, and you could be converted like this. Now it's meant to be, it's like what they say, bar mitzvahs, right? It's not the end of your journey, it's the beginning. But it's a very different concept of what it means to commit yourself to a new way of life, to a new religion, to a new way of understanding God. And people who are coming from Jewish or Christian traditions, there's an assumption that somebody who wants to convert to Islam, like you already worship the right God, what's the problem? Right? Allah is simply the Arabic word for God. And Jews and Christians who worship in Arabic also call God Allah. I actually used to, when I lived in Jerusalem, go regularly to a Syrian synagogue. And I often sat next to a very, very elderly woman. I think she was probably in her 130s. Probably wearing all the clothing she had ever worn in her life at the same time. She was fascinating. And she would call out from the balcony, like whenever they were chanting, they would sometimes call out Allah, Allah, God, God. And sometimes she'd call it Aywa, Aywa, yes in Arabic, yes, yes, instead of Amen. So Allah is just the name of the same God, that as far as anybody who really understands Judaism, Christianity, and Islam believe, like it's the same God that we're all worshiping, and we're just using different names. It's like El. Well, so this is another, like in Jewish tradition, there's a very number of different Jewish traditions, but we have like 72 names for God. In Jewish tradition, there's a whole, that's a 72. Oh yeah, fun stuff. And in Islam, there's a tradition that there are 99 names for God. I'm very much hoping that later in the spring that we will do some fun, possibly like speed dating style tech study with some of the people from the Islamic Center at NYU on pairing up some of those names, because we have a lot of the same names for God.
I'm hoping that there can be a convergence at some point where we have a mutual service, combining a Jewish service and an Islamic service, each one either here or there. I don't see why it couldn't happen here.
Well, we're going to get to the prayer in a little bit, and then we can talk about like what are some of the similarities and what are some of the ways in which we're doing very similar prayers some of the time. And it's I've felt very, very comfortable praying in mosques, and I mean I don't speak Arabic, but when they say El Rahum Hanun, it's a little familiar, right? El Rahum Hanun, our great and merciful God. It's we really are cousins in a lot of ways in that sense. So the 5 pillars of Islam may sound quite familiar. Belief. There is no God but God. Sounds a little bit like Shema Yisrael. Listen up, Jews. Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Our God, that God's one, is the core statement of what it is to be a Muslim, and is the core statement of what it is to be a Jew. Worship 5 times a day I would be a terrible, terrible Muslim. Although my Muslim friends often say we don't do the dawn thing either. Dawn is hard. But there's a whole series of steps that goes into all 5 of those prayer sessions. Their prayer sessions are much, much shorter than ours, otherwise they'd get nothing done. But there's some of the same reasons behind them. The way that we look at the Jewish morning, afternoon, and evening prayers coming from moments in the Torah. And we say that, like, Abraham went out to pray in the morning, so we pray in the morning. And then Isaac went out into the field in the afternoon, and so we pray in the afternoon. And Jacob sat down to pray in the evening, so we pray in the evening. There are similar ways that they draw from the tradition to find these 5 moments in the day.
Yeah, I love your guy.
But unlike with Jews, where we,
I said it 3 times.
you might want to, if you can find another chair or two, that would be great. Thank you. Oh, you can sit on that too? Great, okay. Anyway, you good? Oh, great. Oh, no.
That's what I. No, people are bad.
You need like the beep, 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 beep thing, let you know where you're coming, right, yeah. Excuse me. Totally lost my train of thought about the prayer. So unlike in Jewish tradition where, I mean, if you think about people who go to prayer services 3 times a day, religious Jews, people who are looking for a place to say Kaddish for someone that they've lost and who want to be regularly attending prayer service, because we have this concept of a minyan, that if you pray with less than 10 Jews, then it's not really, you don't get to say certain core prayers. In Islam, it's perfectly fine. Like, it's still preferable to be with other people, but there's no requirement in the same way. And so this is why sometimes in New York City especially, you'll see like cab drivers, you'll see people just at their office in a hallway, you'll see people in the street, in lobbies of buildings, that whenever it's time to pray, just unrolling a rug, taking off their shoes, doing a very minimal, sometimes just very symbolic kind of washing of hands and feet and face, and then being able to do the prayers in really just a few minutes anywhere that is comfortable to do so. I saw a few hands. No? Got it? Great. And I will actually say that once in Jerusalem, when I was taking off from the airport in Israel, and I was in the gate waiting to leave, there was a great moment where there were 2 Muslim men, 3 Jewish men, and then a few other random people who all started praying at the same time, and they all just kind of went over to the same corner to do so, just to be out of the way. And I was early enough in my experience living in Israel that I also just went over and put on and like started praying with them, and they didn't notice me till the end, which was good, because the Muslims didn't care, but the Jews did. But it's really something that they can pray anywhere, at any time. And there are, windows of when you do that, but it's, again, the word Islam, the idea that it's about being subservient to God, that it's about being obedient to God, that there's this really constant reminder, that there's constant repetitions of the same words, of saying that there is no God but God, and that God is great, and restating that and vowing, punctuating the entire day from waking up in the morning until going to bed. Not everybody does all of this, right? Again, this is, remember if I were doing the Judaism 101, this would, there's no way I could get the entire range of practice. We'll get more into that later in the series. Today is really just about the very overarching, what does it look like on paper? And then we will have the people enrich in all of this as we keep going. Fasting. That sounds familiar. And the word for fasting is som. The Hebrew word for fasting? Som, yeah. There's something wonderful about having languages that are like languages of prayer that are also cousins to each other. Because there are a lot of things that wind up feeling very familiar. During the month of Ramadan, observant Muslims will fast from dawn to dusk every day for a month. One of my Muslim classmates and I were comparing notes once, and she said, I just don't know how you do 25 hours of fasting. That's crazy. Like, how do you do that on Yom Kippur? And I was like, but you do this for a month. And each of us was looking at the other and saying, but what you do, what we do is, it's okay, it's not great, what we're doing, but what you do is crazy. But then the other thing about Ramadan, so we always have Yom Kippur in the fall, is that Ramadan moves around. So the way that the Islamic calendar works, it's entirely lunar, right? The Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, but it's kind of modified by the solar calendar, that we have this leap month that adds in every now and then to kind of reset us. So that our holidays, especially the ones that are harvest holidays or that are connected to particular seasons, stay in their right seasons. The Muslim tradition does not have that. The holidays are not connected to seasons and harvests in the same way. And so literally the holidays just travel. Every year they travel around the calendar. So one year, this past year, Ramadan started on June 5th, which is the day I graduated from rabbinical school.
Yay.
That was fun. And next year it will start a little bit earlier, and then the year after that a little bit earlier, and eventually it will start in December, and eventually it will start in October, and it will keep going around. So how long that day is, and what those fasts look like, and what those holidays look like, they're not connected to a season, right? I think about friends who grew up with Christmas in the Northeast, and they can't imagine Christmas without snow.
Jesus couldn't be there.
It doesn't start snowing in Bethlehem until like late January. So yeah, it's true. But there's no connection of a particular season to any one of these holidays. They really just move around the calendar, and they stay totally within that lunar cycle. Moving the page. Oh, almsgiving, that's such a great zakat, tzedakah. Yep. There's actually two different ways that Islam looks at this zakat. There's a fixed amount they're supposed to give, right? In Judaism, they say we're supposed to give 10%, which, if you were a farmer 3,000 years ago, that probably made a lot of sense. Today, that's much harder to kind of calculate 10% of what. And
Well, the princes, 10% of the oil revenue should go to the people.
Yes.
That would end a lot of violence and a lot of craziness.
No, I'm talking about the Jews, though. Like we say, the Jewish tradition, we say 10%. And people calculate in different ways, and people figure out what's the way that makes the most sense, that feels the most right with our moral and ethical beliefs. In Islam, there's I think it's a 2.5%. I think it's a 2.5% that's a fixed amount that you're supposed to give, regardless of your income. And then there's another amount that is really supposed to be based on, well, how much more can you give? And how much more generous can you be? And I'll say that this is something that I've seen in really interesting ways. Again, so when I was regularly going to this Syrian synagogue in Jerusalem, the ways that religious communities have influenced each other around the world and throughout history, and we've picked up melodies from each other, we've picked up ethics from each other, we've picked up philosophies. In a lot of Sephardic synagogues, I shouldn't say a lot, in certain Sephardic synagogues, if you want to have an aliyah to the Torah, you still kind of have to pay for it. And they'll even say, like, okay, second aliyah, not second aliyah, that's for the Levites. The fourth aliyah, who wants the fourth aliyah? 30 shekels, going once, going twice. Oh, we've got 100 shekels with Moshe over here. Great, Moshe. But who was it? 320 shekels. On a Shabbat morning. It's fascinating.
The same thing, right?
There's a way in which it's about the social pressure to be like, okay, but we can give more. We can give more, because the more you can give, the more we want to honor you. And that's really like where that came from, Jews living in Muslim majority societies. And the different ways in which public events would provide occasions to put a little bit of like putting pressure on the people who everyone knew had what to give. To be like, but look, we really want to honor you. So if you give a little bit more, then we can honor you with this. And it's a really funny way in which like Jewish and Muslim societies influenced each other in these particular ways. With this almost competitive, like, but who's gonna, you're gonna give more, right? No, but you can give a little more. We know you can give more than that. And there are actually, it's really interesting. There are actually separate banks. There are Muslim banks set up that really work to make sure, like to help people plan ahead. What is your zakat going to look like in the next year, in the next 5 years? If you know you're going to finish paying off your student loans 2 years from now, how do you plan ahead for how your zakat is going to increase? There are ways in which this is taken incredibly seriously in certain places, in certain contexts, and then there are certain people who simply don't pay attention to it at all. Again, just like...
And what happens to those people? Are they punished? Are they exiled? Are Muslims who don't believe in, who would just want to be non-religious but spiritual in their own way? In America, we're used to a lot of freedom, but what happens is there like super mass conformity is my stereotype.
It just simply depends on the country. Look, right now, I mean, I'm mostly talking about just Islam as it developed and as the scholars teach it. The way that it works in the U.S. is the way that things work for Jews in the U.S. If you're somebody of any religion in New York who's spiritual but not religious, you're somebody in New York who's spiritual but not religious. You know, it really depends on the country. And if we wanted to get into different countries' laws, or if we wanted to get into what it meant to be somebody who comes from a very, very strictly, very, let's say, orthodox religious community, and wants to be nonconformist in certain ways, it depends on what country it is. It depends on what you have access to. I mean, you know, it's like asking, well, what if a Jewish woman wants to get divorced? That answer is going to depend a whole lot on what kind of Jewish community she's living in, what country she's living in. Are religious laws enforced over civil laws or not? Right? Like the answer is incredibly dependent on a whole lot of things in the same way that it is for us. So as we get into like later courses and through, this is the first in a long series, if there are particular places, if we want to look at particular places where like religious law, civil law, how those things affect each other, that would be an incredible class to have. But it's not something I can easily answer.
Sure. I'm sorry I jumped ahead.
No, it's fine. And then the fifth pillar of Islam is Hajj. You say Chag Sameach, right?
Hajj.
Chag is Hajj. Because in Jewish tradition, the things that we call a Chag, when we say Chag Sameach, those were actually pilgrimage festivals, right? Shavuot, you actually brought your first fruits. So for Muslims, it's the hope that everyone gets to, at least once in their life, make pilgrimage to go to Mecca, which is where Islam was born, and which is where the Kaaba is, the large black stone structure, monolith, cube.
Is it any time of year we go on the Hajj? We can do it any time of year?
People can go any time of year, but it's considered better to go for one of the festivals. If you're at the very end of Ramadan, the festival that ends Ramadan is really the time when most people want to go, but it's also one of the Eid festivals. But you can go any time of year. So some people go during Eid because they can't. It's more expensive to go during Eid. There's literally millions of people who go. But to actually go and to walk around this Kaaba, to walk around this holy spot where everybody faces that spot when they pray. Right. The Kaaba, that Muslims believe to be a house that Abraham built for God. And literally like walking in Abraham's footsteps by walking usually 7 times around the Kaaba. If you ever see, and this is like only in the very religious communities, if you ever see a Muslim man whose beard is henna, is red, that's somebody who is very religious and who has made this pilgrimage. In Muslim communities, I mean, especially if you're ever in Jerusalem, if you're in East Jerusalem, if you're in the old city of Jerusalem, and you're walking through places where there are a lot of Muslim residents, you'll sometimes see on the walls like little crescents and stars, little stencils of the Kaaba, of domes, of like stars and moons and whatever. That means that somebody has just come home from making a Hajj, from making the pilgrimage. And there's all this celebratory, when I say graffiti, I mean it in a positive way, but there's a celebratory decorative stuff that happens to welcome somebody back from the Hajj, because it's considered like the pinnacle of your religious life to be able to
And
do
they'll call him, my honorific, they'll call him Haji.
Yes, yes, especially in a community where not many people are able to make the pilgrimage. Then it's sometimes they'll communally pool their resources to send a few people, and then really giving them the honor of like calling them Haji, like you say, that like they're the ones who went on behalf of the community, and there's something lovely about that. I am trying to remember what time we started and I don't.
We started at 9 o'clock. 8:30.
8:30.
Great, okay, good, so I've got a little bit. Prayer. And again, please share.
But if you want to look at it in the meantime.
I did.
Okay, thank you.
I ran out of white paper.
Yeah.
Yes.
Marissa, are women allowed to make the pilgrimage, number one, but more importantly, are they allowed to walk around the Kaaba?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
Women are absolutely. It's really interesting because there's ways in which the prayer life and the ritual life of women in Islam is much more equal than we're used to it being in Judaism in terms of what's supposed to be, right? Like you think about in Jewish tradition, men are obligated in the prayers and women it's optional, right? And for a whole bunch of different reasons that are no longer totally relevant to our lives in this day and age. But Muslim women actually, like from the very beginning of Islam, and part of this is because Muhammad's wife, Khadija, was more accomplished than he was a better businesswoman than he was more educated than he was, really was his teacher in many ways. But there's a lot of interesting equality, religious equality, and also in terms of like women have always been able to own their own property. Women have traditionally not taken their husband's last name because they're not considered by law to be their property in the same way that if you think about like medieval Europe, right, that you really were chattel. It's very, very different. Now, how that gets interpreted in different societies and in different cultures, all over the map, like really all over the map. But women are absolutely like in communities where people pray 5 times a day, men and women both pray 5 times a day. In communities where it is a value to make pilgrimage, men and women both do pilgrimage.
Together?
And I've also
Together?
often yes, yeah. And I will say that actually one of the best Quran recitations I've ever heard in my life was by a 7-year-old girl who had memorized the whole Quran.
Oh.
Wow.
Can they be an imam? Can they be like a priest?
No,
No.
right now.
Then it's like Catholicism.
Women, so like in some parts of Orthodoxy in the Jewish tradition, women can chant a call to prayer for each other, but not for men. So but again, it depends on where, and that gets into the more complexities of like which culture, which country, which tradition.
Well, like Judaism, there are movements within Islam for female imams, and now, like in some countries, like Sweden and other countries, there are women's mosques that are run by women, and so there is a feminist movement that's, just like in Judaism, that's changing a lot of that.
Totally.
In the mosques, I was in a mosque in Northern Cyprus, which is Turkey, and they have like a mechitza, so the men sat separately, right?
Yeah.
And we were talking mechitza, it really was.
I mean, I will say, a Muslim friend once said to me, she's like, look, I don't want to look at anybody else's rear end when they're bowing, and I don't want them looking at mine. And granted that then, kind of means that there's a very gendered idea of who's looking at whose tohas.
Right.
Right. But definitely there's the gender separation is still much more widespread than it was, say, even 50 years ago in the U.S. in the Jewish community. But there's a lot of things changing in a lot of different parts of the world. But again, this is something that I'd love to get into, like, and be much more like bring some good examples and bring some good stories from different places that are really getting this full spectrum of what's happening. So the prayers themselves are actually relatively easy, relatively straightforward. I'm just going to read. So So, so you can say there's a whole thing like how do you stand, when do you bow, what do you say, the transliteration from the Arabic. And it start by saying, God is great, God is the greatest, Allahu Akbar. I seek God's shelter from Satan, the condemned. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. All praise is due to God, Lord of the worlds, the most gracious, the most merciful, master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for assistance. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those upon whom you have bestowed your blessings, not the path of those with whom you are angry, nor the path of those who have gone astray.
So there's the potential.
And that's the beginning of the
That's
Quran.
the beginning, but there's the potential for the, the biases against other people. The decision of who's gone astray.
Who were you angry with who had gone astray?
Right.
And the Sunni Shias have the same exact format. Yes. Yes. And we'll have another whole thing about like the different sects and how those developed. But all Muslims of all sects, the same words are in the prayers. And this is the basic for all 5 of the prayer services. The only thing that's different. The only thing that's different, I wrote this down somewhere because it's one of my favorite things, and I'm always afraid I'm gonna. For the dawn prayer, the whoever's doing the call to prayer adds in the call to prayer the phrase, prayer is better than sleep. And they actually include that in the call to prayer. Prayer is better than sleep, right? It's like they're calling out, God is great, come to prayer, prayer is better than sleep. So that if you're still lying in bed and it's 5 o'clock in the morning and the sun's just like a little edge starting to come over and it's like, oh God, no, okay, really, yes, all right, prayer is better than sleep, I'm gonna get up and go do it. But it's a very straightforward set of prayers. I would encourage you, if you have a Siddur at home, to see how many of these lines you can find, close to word by word for word in the Siddur. A lot of the text is really incredibly similar because the focus is on this regular repetition that there is one God and we recognize that, and that is the God we worship. There's that one God. We got it, monotheists all the way, God. On the next page, right, it says, all good things and all prayers are for God. The peace and mercy of God be upon you, Muhammad. Peace be on all of us and upon God's righteous servants. I bear witness that there is no God except God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Whenever Muhammad is named, almost always, it's with the word Prophet Muhammad, the messenger Muhammad. There was a real concern in the early days after Muhammad died among the followers that he himself would be deified. And there was a real concern that no, Muhammad is not a deity. Muhammad is very clear apparently in his own sayings and writings and the things that his students and descendants wrote, that he was really a humble messenger and really emphasized the humility. But is also the transmitter, is somehow the conduit for this confirmation. There's a way in which Muhammad is treated as like the bookend on the other side of the shelf from Abraham, that the covenant that God started with Abraham, Muslims consider to have been completed with Muhammad. That here's where the teaching started, here's where the journey began, that all of these seeds of prophecy that were planted, that all of this historical stuff that happened, and the people who spoke about it and called about what was going to happen, and how to come back to a path of peace and justice, despite all of the things that were happening, that Muhammad is the end of that, and that how do we, that how Muslims understand Muhammad is that there's this constant resetting of oneself, the constant resetting of, okay, but God's there, and I'm here. And here's this tradition that I've inherited. And ending with, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmah to Allah. May the peace and mercy of God be on you. 5 times a day. I mean, you can imagine if you really do this 5 times a day, it's quite an intense experience. And I will just say that I hope you will all come back for, this is going to be happening every month. Each month it will be something slightly different. We're going to invite other speakers in. At some point we're going to do I said before, like a speed dating style, like let's learn with our cousins from the Islamic Center at NYU and study some texts together. Because it's a really, really rich and fascinating tradition. And it's one that there's a lot more familiarity than you might think to find in it. And also a lot more diversity in the beliefs and practices of our Muslim neighbors, both in New York and around the world, than you might expect.
Third Friday?
Third Friday in every month. Yeah.
And there's 1.8 billion of them, and there's 12 million of us.
That's
So
true.
someone else must be conceiving that it's plausible or something.
What, say that again? Didn't hear
There's
that.
1.8 billion Muslims, and there's 12 million Jews. So it
Yeah.
can't be so far-fetched that people can't conceive of a different religion, you know, on this planet.
Thank you.
Hey,